You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. We were joined by author David Price, who came to discuss his book, Winning the 10 Crucial Days. The book looks at the various factors that went into the success of General Washington's campaign to attack Trenton and Princeton in the 10 days between December 25, 1776 and January 3, 1777. Mr. Price joined our roundtable discussion on Zoom, and what follows is a recording of our conversation. So we're here tonight to discuss David Price's book, Winning the 10 Crucial Days, which, of course, the 10 Crucial Days refers to the events surrounding the Trenton and Princeton campaigns in late 1776. We've looked at this from a lot of different directions, but I thought David had a really interesting new point of view on this, so David, I'm just going to turn it right over to you and then let you get started.
Okay, thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to be back. This new book, I guess, is I like to think of it as the capstone volume to a TCD trilogy. Everything has to have an acronym, of course. I've written 5 books, and I would say 3.5 are TCD related. So what I've tried to do with each volume is to craft something that's unique, that is an interpretation you're not going to find in the other books, nor in any of the other books that have been written about this monumental period. And obviously, there have been some very fine ones to date. This new one is really different, I suppose, or the framework it employs is different than what you're going to typically find in history books generally, because it doesn't employ a more or less straight line chronological paradigm. There is a chronology in the introduction, brief chronology, along with an equally synoptic assessment of the state of the rebellion prior to this campaign and immediately after the campaign, for the benefit of those readers who are not intimately familiar with the subject. And I certainly don't assume that everybody or anybody who picks up the book is. That's in the introduction, and then that's followed by a series of chapters, 5 chapters, each of which focuses on what I like to call an interpretive theme, or I suppose you could call it an analytical factor, being in order of priority and the order in which they appear in the book, and hence the order in which I'm going to discuss them here. Leadership, geography, weather, artillery, and contingency. I guess I'd also mention that I've included 3 appendices at the end, one of which really kind of doubles down on this unique approach where I've tried to quantify soft data in what is admittedly a very subjective enterprise. I say that right up front, where I'm assigning points to each of these, the various elements within these factors, and then computing a total for each factor and assigning a percentage contribution to it in terms of how much it impacted the outcome of this campaign. That idea wasn't original with me. It was suggested to me by one of the reviewers, Jim Martin, the late James Kirby Martin, who unfortunately left us last New Year's Eve. But he had suggested, based on his experience as a visiting lecturer at West Point and the Citadel, after he retired from his day job, where he was a professor at the University of Houston, that this kind of attempt to quantify this stuff might really resonate with faculty at institutions like that. They might want to, assign it for coursework. So, and I remember thinking when he suggested it that I had absolutely no idea. I thought it was an intriguing idea, but I had absolutely no idea how to do it. And then I went for a long walk and I came back and I started to do it. So that's in there. And then I've also included a glossary of those military terms that are used in the narrative, but not defined there, unlike some terms that are defined in the narrative. And then the last appendix is an effort to encourage visitation to the relevant local sites. So there's some information there about each of the TCD-related sites, the 2 Washington Crossing Parks in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, respectively, Princeton Battlefield State Park, the old Barracks Museum in Trenton and the Trenton Battle Monument. And one other thing I would mention parenthetically before I get into the meat of this is that I wanted to, and I did this in the chapter on leadership primarily, give long overdue recognition to a couple of American unsung heroes, I'll call them. One of whom I'd written about previously, that was Edward Hand. The other one I had not really gone into any depth on in any of the books. I did write an article about him for JAR, but that was John Cadwalader. So one of the things I hope is that, for those people who do read the book, that they'll have a newfound appreciation for what these two men did during this campaign. Okay, so, well, Mike briefly, and you're probably all familiar with it anyway, but briefly reference what the 10 Crucial Days campaign is about. And of course, that's the 10 days from December 25th, 1776 through January 3rd, 1777, when Washington's army won their first three significant victories of the war. Its significance is twofold, really. One, that the first three significant victories that Washington's army won during that period changed the whole momentum of the contest. Just when it appeared that our quest for independence might be on life support. And it also changed the public image of Washington, because up until this point, he had lost every major battle he had fought. And a growing number of people, including some of his own officers and some members of Congress, were beginning to think he was a pretty inept and decisive leader, which he had been. But now all of a sudden he was a military genius and a national hero. So those are the five factors that I referenced. And as I said, there's a chapter on each in the book in this order. So what do I mean by these interpretive themes or analytical factors? I would think it's fairly self-evident, really, in each case, but to discuss them, leadership involves the strategy, tactics, character, and competence of officers on both sides as they relate to the events of this period, including, in particular, in the Continental Army, Washington, of course, Henry Knox, Nathanael Greene. I mentioned my two favorite unsungs, Hand and Cadwalader. And then on the other side, William Howe, Lord Cornwallis, Charles Mahood, who distinguished himself at Princeton, and the two most relevant or prominent German officers, Hessian officers, Johann Gottlieb Rall and Karl von Donop, his immediate superior. Geography, of course, entails a discussion of the terrain and natural barriers, especially in this case, the Delaware River and Assunpink Creek, running from the Delaware up through Trenton, that impinged very much on the course of this campaign, and the implications of related events during this period for those who were living in the area and how they responded to those. Weather, of course, deals with the natural elements, including temperature, precipitation, river ice, and road conditions, how they impacted Army maneuvers, the nature of combat, and the readiness to fight. Artillery entails a discussion of how important cannon were to the outcome of all three battles during this campaign, and how the Americans' numerical advantage in and effective deployment of those weapons played a vital role in their success, with special attention to the exploits of Henry Knox, who of course created the Army's artillery wing, and the captains of individual artillery companies, such as Joseph Mulder, who especially distinguished himself at Princeton, and Alexander Hamilton. That's when he wasn't singing. And then lastly, contingency is what I like to call an elegant term for what might otherwise be known as sheer dumb luck. And that obviously overlaps with the effects of weather, but it's a broader concept because it also embodies decisions and non-weather events that redounded to the benefit of Washington's army. Now, as I say in the book, questions are sure to arise about the precise meaning of these terms. For example, to what extent should we consider leadership at a conceptual level in terms of individual temperament or ability or qualifications, as opposed to concentrating on things like strategy and tactics? Is contingency more than just sheer chance or luck or good fortune? And then two, of course, these factors overlap. So where do you draw the line between weather and contingency, or between leadership and the use of artillery, poor leadership and a decision to take advantage of certain geographic factors. So as I say in the book, I do not attempt to find distinctions between these various elements because frankly, I think it would be an exercise in futility. But having said that, I still hope that this framework, and I think it does, it will help us better understand the military action that occurred during what were perhaps the 10 most remarkable days in American history. So, as I suggested before, the quality of leadership is the priority factor, the overriding one in this analysis, because it was foundational to the issue of this campaign. Incompetent or unimaginative or uninspiring direction of the American forces would not have rescued the rebellion from its military nadir over a fabled few days, regardless of how the other ingredients in Washington's recipe for victory played out. On the other hand, leadership that meant the moment, when it was combined with the auspicious effects of favorable geography, weather that accommodated the needs of an army, the skilled use of numerically superior artillery, and fortuitous developments that we might call contingency, could and did win the 10 crucial days. So what are some examples of how decisions and actions by leadership on both sides influenced the outcome of this campaign? Well, first and foremost, the most obvious one, which of course has been written about many times before, is Washington's bold and enterprising vision and conduct in regard to the 3 battles that were fought during this period, 2 at Trenton and 1 at Princeton. And there's also Henry Knox's direction of the Army's Delaware River crossing on Christmas night, 1776, and following that up with his leadership of the American artillery during all 3 battles. On the other side, there's the erroneous assumption that was made by General William Howe, who, of course, was the overall commander of the Anglo-German forces in New Jersey at the time, that the German troops, the Hessians, who were occupying Trenton under Colonel Rall, would be safe from an attack by Washington's army. Not so much. There was the failure of British and Hessian field commanders, Rall and von Donop in particular, to cooperate along with General James Grant in New Brunswick and General Alexander Leslie in Princeton, to cooperate successfully in seeking to deter an American attack on Colonel Rall's brigade in Trenton. And then to pick on Lord Cornwallis, there were the tactical errors that he committed, which proved to be very serious, very fateful. By approaching Trenton from Princeton on January 2nd in one column, without employing a second column to outflank the Americans on their right, as he had been advised to do by Colonel von Donop, who knew the terrain much better than Cornwallis. And then, number 2, failing to effectively monitor the movement of Washington's troops after that second Battle of Trenton, or the Battle of Assunpink Creek, on the night of January 2nd and 3rd, 1777, when, of course, they marched around Cornwallis's left flank up to Princeton, where they won the capstone victory of the campaign. The good news for General Howe at this point in mid-December was that his successful invasion of New Jersey had penetrated some 80 to 90 miles from the Hudson River, where the North River was then known, to the banks of the Delaware, or Trenton, and below that to Bordentown and Burlington, which were occupied by Hessian troops. The bad news, of course, was that he now had to assume the burden of securing such a wide swath of territory and to protect those loyalist residents who resided in or near the occupied region, which was one of his motivating factors for arranging the troops in these various cantonments, as they were known. We know that because he wrote that, without his having an army large enough for this undertaking. The corridor that he was attempting to control stretched for some 300 square miles, although it represented only about 5% of New Jersey's land area and a tiny portion of the North American continent. That made the task no less challenging. And this was especially so given the threat and the actuality of continued harassment of the Hessian Brigade occupying Trenton by local militia, and their exposed position being isolated at the westernmost end of the Anglo-German troop alignment, and thus most vulnerable to a strike by Washington from across the river. Some examples of how geography influenced this campaign. Well, one I've already alluded to, first and foremost, I guess, would be the dimensions of the area that His Majesty's forces were attempting to occupy that winter, which stretched from the Delaware River all the way up to Perth Amboy, or Amboy as it was then known, and simply exceeded their capacity to effectively control. Related to that was the distance between the outposts, or cantonments as they were known, that were occupied by the Crown's forces, which rendered the most exposed outposts, particularly Trenton at the westernmost end of this configuration, especially vulnerable to militia raids and ultimately an attack by Continental troops. There was also the fact that Howe's troops were unable to pursue Washington's army across the Delaware from New Jersey to Pennsylvania between December 8th and 14th, before the British and Hessians went into winter quarters, because they couldn't find boats, and for whatever reason, and I suppose there's a lot that could be said about that, they made no effort, certainly no significant effort, to obtain or build boats, which would have been at least theoretically possible if they were really serious about pursuing Washington's army across the river at that point. Two other factors here going further on in the 10 Crucial Days campaign. There was, when we get to the events of January 2nd, 1777, and the Second Battle of Trenton, the swollen and rapid currents of Assunpink Creek, which posed an obstacle to Cornwallis's effort to destroy Washington's army on that occasion. Another factor, which is not often mentioned, I don't know that I've ever seen it actually discussed in any book on the TCD, but if we go to the next day's event, January 3rd, and the climactic Battle of Princeton, the fact that there were no significant natural or man-made impediments on the Princeton battlefield to the rapid movement of Washington's numerically superior force. During this campaign, the combination of a consequential river barrier, as I've just alluded to, and the vagaries of atmospheric conditions rewarded Washington's troops by permitting them passage and denying it to the British and Hessians, who lacked either the solid ice or boats that would have enabled them to get across one way or the other. And then the river conveniently waited to freeze over until Washington's army had driven the enemy out of the area, and indeed most of New Jersey. So to that extent, one might say, as I do in the book, that Britain's hopes for vanquishing the rebellion at this point were, in a manner of speaking, skating on thin ice. Some examples of how weather influenced the campaign. Well, as I've already mentioned, the fact that the river did not freeze over until after the King's troops were no longer positioned to take advantage of it to march across from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. Something that's often been written about, of course, the blizzard that obscured the march of Washington's troops to Trenton in the early morning hours of December 26th, after their Christmas night crossing, which may have lulled the Hessian garrison in Trenton into a false sense of security, prompting them to cancel their normal evening and morning patrols. And related to that, the conditions that were created by the storm, which made it difficult for the Hessians to repulse the American attack at Trenton on December 26th, because those troops who were defending against Nathaniel Greene's division coming in from the northwest side of the town had the wind and the elements blowing in their faces. And so that obviously limited their visibility, in addition to impeding their ability to fire because of the effect it had on their cartridges and the firing mechanisms on their muskets. Two other factors moving further along in this campaign period, as we get to the Second Battle of Trenton, the rain and relatively warm weather on the night of January 1st and 2nd, 1777, that turned the road from Princeton to Trenton into a muddy morass and impeded Lord Cornwallis's march to Trenton. Of course, along with the delaying action by Edward Hand's men. And finally, later that day or that night, there was the freeze that descended on the Delaware Valley, which dropped the temperatures by about 20 degrees. So solidified, hardened the ground, that it facilitated the movement of Washington's artillery from Trenton to Princeton, even though they had to contend with ruts and stumps and stuff of that sort. But the hardened ground along the path that the army took definitely made things easier for them than it had been for Cornwallis earlier in the day. So as I think I've kind of indicated, the success of Washington's army in this campaign was to a very large extent a result of the sizable advantage that they enjoyed in the number of field guns over the enemy in each of the three battles. Primary sources concur on the respective totals for the two sides at the First Battle of Trenton, but they vary for the other two engagements. Taking into consideration the various estimates, I think we can say that the American superiority in field pieces was about as follows: 18-6 at Trenton, at the First Battle of Trenton, about 40-28 at the Second Battle at Assunpink Creek, and something like 35-6 or 35-8 at Princeton on January 3rd. I believe that, as I said in the book, that cannon fire really powered the Americans to victory in all three battles, and that there's little reason to doubt that the American gun crews and their weaponry, again operating under Knox's adroit direction, were indispensable to winning this campaign. The heavy use of massed artillery was decisive in all three battles. Contingency. So, as I've suggested, a healthy and timely measure of good luck for Washington, bad luck for his adversary, accounted in part for the rebels' success that winter. Their victories at Trenton and Princeton were aided by key determinants over which Washington's army had no control, specifically the impact of weather on the circumstances surrounding those encounters, but also decisions by opposing officers that created opportunities for the Americans to exploit. In the days leading up to this winter offensive, General Nathaniel Greene, in his correspondence with John Hancock, then the President of Congress, pondered the relationship of chance to the outcome of military actions. As he wrote, and I quote, "The fate of war is so uncertain, dependent on so many contingencies." So I cite a number of examples in this chapter. I'm going to mention two of them here. One was the capture of General Charles Lee by British dragoons in the early morning hours of December 13th, when he arguably foolishly was away from his encampment and staying at a tavern in Basking Ridge. His capture arguably freed, although it was thought at the time to be both sides really to be a unmitigated disaster for the colonial cause, because the American cause, because Lee was the Washington's second in command, was probably the most experienced of all the generals in Washington's army, and thought by many people, especially by Lee, to have a better claim to being commander-in-chief of that army than Washington. But in any case, Lee's capture arguably freed Washington to carry out the plans that he was developing at that point for his winter offensive, without being hampered by his second-in-command's typical skeptical attitude towards Washington's direction of the army. And it also expedited the arrival of desperately needed reinforcements, some 2,000 men under Lee's command, who, once he was captured, his second-in-command, General John Sullivan, in contrast with Lee's very dilatory movement across New Jersey to join up with Washington, notwithstanding the latter's pleas for him to expedite that movement, Sullivan acted much more expeditiously and joined up with Washington's army very quickly after Lee's capture. And that gave Washington enough troops to the point where he could seriously contemplate going on the offensive. And the other instance I want to mention here is the raid that was conducted by General Adam Stevens, by about 50 soldiers in General Adam Stevens' Virginia Brigade on the evening of December 25th, separate and independent from the general movement of Washington's main attack force across the Delaware River that night. That raid, Washington was furious when he discovered that raid had occurred, which he did when his army was marching south after they crossed the Delaware towards Trenton in the early morning hours of December 26th, and he ran into these 50 soldiers coming back from their maneuver. He had no idea what they were doing there. When he found out, he was furious at Stephen, because he thought that Stephen had blown Washington's cover, that the Hessians would now be ready for an attack. However, Stephen may have inadvertently done Washington a huge favor, because Colonel Rawl, while we no documentation of what his mindset was at that point, it's quite possible, if not probable, that he believes the attack, this raid, was the attack about which he had been warned by General James Grant, the British commander in New Jersey, up in New Brunswick, or Brunswick as it was then known, based on intel that Grant had received from a spy in Washington's encampment. And if Rawl believed that was in fact the case, then perhaps this raid encouraged him to be a little less vigilant than he might otherwise have been. So the reality of warfare, of course, is that a battle plan is often the first casualty of battle, and contingency obviously has a lot to say about that. The 10 crucial days were certainly no exception to that rule, as multiple instances immediately before and during that period illustrate the role of chance in determining how combat unfolds. Karl von Clausewitz may have said it best in his iconic volume on military theory from 1832 on war, or Vom Krieg, and I quote, "In war more than anywhere else, things do not turn out as we expect," unquote. Then again, as I said in the book, those who are averse to ascribing human events solely to chance or luck or fortune, and who are willing to make a cerebral leap from military to athletic competition, might take refuge in the adage that was famously set forth by a venerable figure from the world of professional sports, One Branch Rickey. Perhaps the legendary baseball executive had it right when he insisted that, and I quote, "Luck is the residue of design." Now, a somewhat parallel observation was made many years before Mr. Rickey in a Latin proverb cited by the Roman poet Virgil in his epic poem Aeneid in 19 BC. And I never took Latin, so forgive me in advance. I'm going to torture the heck out of this pronunciation, but the saying is Audentis fortuna luvat, which in English roughly translates to fortune favors the bold or fortune favors the brave. This is maybe my favorite quote from the 10 Crucial Days by the British historian Sir George Otto Trevelyan, who wrote this in his celebrated multi-volume work about the American Revolution, entitled The American Revolution, around the turn of the 20th century. Context in which he writes that makes it very clear that he's referring solely to the Christmas night crossing of the Delaware by Washington's army and their attack on the Hessians. But I like to think of it by extension as essentially, encompassing the entire 10 Crucial Days campaign. I'm going to wrap up by reading sort of verbatim, or more than verbatim, more verbatim than not, from the epilogue. At the formal end of hostilities in 1783, more than 6.5 years after this campaign ended, one might say the same outcome held for Washington soldiers as in the aftermath of their legendary winter campaign, and that is that they had won the contest by not losing it. In doing so, their cause finally reached a secure shore, to employ a metaphor from the pen of John Adams that is far more expansive than the Delaware River crossing, but suggests an equally turbulent waterborne passage. To his wife Abigail, he writes in the summer of 1777, and I quote, "We are now afloat upon a full sea. When we shall arrive at a safe harbor, no mariner has skill and experience enough to foretell, but by the favor of heaven, we shall make a prosperous voyage after all the storms and shoals are past." And as the saying goes, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So thank you for listening.
Thanks so much. I mean, one of the things that I always thought was a key factor as well, I guess, I don't know how you'd put this into your categories, was desperation. The fact that Washington really had no choice but to try something at this point because his entire army was going to end on January 1st. The enlistments were up and they were all going to go home because everything was such a mess. Even though Washington had so much trouble getting across the river and was hours past the time he thought would have given him the element of surprise, and even though he thought the element of surprise was again lost when he came across the men who had already attacked Trenton before his army got there, he still went forward because he really, I think, felt there was nothing else he could do. This was kind of a do or die situation. He was had accepted that either outcome was okay, but he wasn't going to surrender without trying something. And so
Yeah.
that sense of desperation really pushed the army in a way that it might not have otherwise.
Yeah, well, the famous story about that is Dr. Benjamin Rush visiting Washington a day or two, I guess, before the Christmas night crossing, and then he sees, Washington's writing on the scraps of paper, and one of them falls to the ground. This is the password, I guess, for the attack, and it says victory or death, and that's to be given out to all the officers. But I think it's important to remember that Washington, being instinctively aggressive when it came to military tactics, I think there's some misconception out there, maybe on the part of some folks, that he was this defensive-minded general, and he often had to act on the defensive, obviously, throughout the war, which I'm sure was excruciatingly frustrating to him. But he was, I think it's fair to say, instinctively aggressive, and we see it, in various occasions. Obviously during the TCD, but later on,
Yeah, he was always fighting
Germantown,
to invade.
Monmouth, whatever you name it. But I think that he had it in mind as when he was crossing, or even before he crossed the river on December 8th to Pennsylvania, that he was going to look, for the first possible opportunity to launch a counterattack. And he had to wait until he was reinforced by Lee's men. And then he also got reinforcements from the Northern Department, from Gates, and was also joined by the Philadelphia Associators, although they were obviously totally green. They had no combat experience at all. But that gave him, enough men that he had a viable opportunity to launch the attack.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing, I guess, is in a more professional army, I think a lot of other field officers might have been less willing to act on their own. But the fact that Cadwalader's men crossed the river completely separate from Washington, they got over a day late, and Washington was already planning to pull back to Pennsylvania at that point, and it was only because the other armies were then crossing and might have been left stranded on their own without the larger Continental Army staying there. I think played a big part in Washington's decision to come back and make a stand at Trenton.
Yeah, that's one of the things that Cadwalader did. Not the only thing, but one of the things he did that I thought, merited the special attention or recognition I tried to give him in the book. Because he recognized, as he said to Washington, and Washington recognized it too. And I think this is a crucial thing to keep in mind, that if all he had done was to launch that raid against the Hessians and then come back to PA, as he did, and stay on the PA side, I don't think it would have changed anything as far as the strategic dynamic or the course of the war. I think he had to come back to New Jersey and expand his offensive, and that was what forced the enemy to, retreat from most of New Jersey in short order. And then, of course, within a few months, they exited the state for good, at least as far as being an occupying force. Obviously, they would fight other engagements in New Jersey. That legendary crossing and victory over the Hessians was a catalyst. It was the launching pad, if you will, for this campaign. So it's certainly significant. But I think that what he did after he crossed back to, or his army crossed back to New Jersey during the period from December 29th to 31st, that really made this significant, turning back Cornwallis at Assunpink Creek, which, to my way of thinking, and of course I've written about this in the past, was clearly one of the most pivotal and arguably the most understated military engagement of the war. And then, of course, that created the opportunity for them to go up to Princeton and clean up there. So,
yeah, I mean, Colonel Hand's leadership was also impressive in holding off Cornwallis's army on that crucial day, preventing them from getting into Trenton during the day. But it was all the more impressive because Hand wasn't actually in command of that force. Originally, it was a French officer named Fermoy who turned tail and ran at the first sight of the enemy. And it very easily could have been the fact that everybody, the rest of his army had followed him had it not been for Hand.
Yeah, I think Fermoy was, well, I don't know for sure, but given what I think we know about him, he may very well have been in a semi-drunken stupor at the time because he really loved the bottle. And I don't know if this was his most egregious offense. He kind of replicated this several months later when he was stationed up at Fort Ty.
Yeah.
July 77. And, the Americans were trying to pull off this covert evacuation of the fort when confronted by Burgoyne's superior force. And as you may recall, Fermoy accidentally set fire to his headquarters. And then for some reason, after that, he was denied a promotion, and he was miffed about that, and he left. So,
Yeah, good
um,
riddance. But,
yeah, but
but I
yes,
mean, his
fortunately,
failure of leadership is really, could have spoiled the entire thing, and it was Hand
yes,
stepping up that prevented that.
yes, fortunately, Hand was there, and he was the perfect person to take charge, and I think the actions that he orchestrated, the actions by his men, may very well have saved, Washington's army from destruction that day, which is why I dedicated the Assunpink Creek book to he and his men,
Uh,
his merry men.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you think Cornwallis, his decision to just basically rush right down and not worry about, having side troops or anything, was a matter of a lack of respect for the Americans, thinking that they weren't going to put up any kind of a stand anyway, and he just wanted to get this over with quickly so he could get on a ship back home to go on vacation?
Well, of course, he'd been given his marching orders by Howe, up until this point, up until the raid on the Hessians. You could argue, and of course we could discuss at length why, but seemed to be treating the Americans with kid gloves. And then, of course, after First Trenton, it seems to decide, okay, no more Mr. Nice Guy. So he tells, Cornwallis, find Washington's army and destroy it. And Cornwallis, of course, was the most aggressive. I think it's fair to say he was the most aggressive probably of the British field commanders during the war. So, yeah, part of it may have been contempt that he felt, he had this superior force, so he should just go, straight ahead at the Americans in one massive or powerful column and do his shock and awe thing. But it's interesting to note, well, a couple things. And this was pointed out in a chapter about Cornwallis it was written by Hugh Rankin. This is going back to the 60s, I think, in a book entitled Washington's Opponents, about the British officers. And he writes that Cornwallis, interestingly enough, never in the battles in which he commanded, which he was the overall commander, he never employed a flanking move like the ones he personally participated in what were, from the standpoint of the numbers of men involved, the two largest battles in the war, Long Island and Brandywine Creek, which I think it's fair to say were instrumental in the outcome of the British victories in those battles. But he never did that, whether it was a matter of temperament or just something from his classical military training. He had studied at a military academy in Turin, Italy, which wasn't something that your average officer did, average British officer. Whether that impacted his thinking, I don't know. Another interesting aspect to this, I don't know if I'm talking out of school here, but hopefully he'll be okay with my saying this. I think I mentioned you earlier, I had just finished reading the manuscript of Larry Kidder's new book. And I'm not sure what he's basing this on, but he seemed to think, I hope I'm quoting him correctly, that Cornwallis didn't really want to fight a battle at Trenton. So that's why he didn't want to launch a flanking maneuver. He wanted to force Washington to retreat, to fall back, to withdraw, and if Washington had, and I said this to Larry, I think it would have been disastrous because they had no boats, or certainly not enough to evacuate across the river, either at Trenton or if they retreated south. And even if they did try to do that, if they tried to get part of their army across the river, Cornwallis would have been hot on his heels.
Yeah.
And so I think it would have been a turkey shoot with his men out, in the boats in the river. If he kept retreating further south, at some point he was going to run out of land because, New Jersey is a peninsula.
Yeah.
I guess I could understand if Cornwallis felt that way, but when you look at how he acted on other occasions, how aggressive he was, I'm not sure that I wouldn't necessarily agree that he didn't want to fight. What I don't understand is if you look at what happened that day when his advance guard gets to Trenton and they launch those series of probes across the Trenton Bridge to try to, get to the other side and presumably find and exploit some weakness in Washington's defenses. And of course, it turns out to be a bloody failure. They're beaten back with heavy losses. There was an incredibly strong, and they could have seen, it was an incredibly strong defensive position that Washington's army was in around where the bridge was, where the main fighting occurred. Artillery, hitting them on both sides, in addition, three sides, in addition to musket and rifle fire. and the Americans were on high ground, looking down on the enemy. Given all that, to me, and I know it's easy to say this in retrospect, but what they were trying to do there, those probes were absolutely pointless unless they coordinated them with a flanking move further up the creek, which Cornwallis, it seems, had it in mind to launch the next morning, January 3rd, when he was expecting to continue the fight, once the daylight came. I would think if he had gotten to Trenton when he wanted to, early to mid-afternoon, if he hadn't been slowed up by, as I like to say, the hand of fate in the muddy morass and the hand of Pennsylvania, maybe they could have launched that coordinated attack. And then, Washington's troops really would have been up the creek more ways than one. But to just launch that attack against the bridge without doing anything further up the creek, I don't understand what they thought they were accomplishing, except to lose a lot of men, which they obviously did. But
Well, I think again that was contempt for the Americans, thinking maybe we can just push them right off and they'll turn and run.
maybe, because obviously they had before. So yeah, maybe that's what they thought. But well, they discovered otherwise.
Does anybody else have a question?
I've been very comprehensive or very boring. Not that the two are mutually exclusive.
No, that was great. This is Dan again, and I do have a question. When Washington took his position at Assunpink Creek, it seems like he really didn't have a outcome in mind until that night when they met to decide to go to Princeton, right? So that was a really precarious position for him to be in without a next step in mind. Is that accurate?
I think he did have that next step in mind. The traditional accounts suggest that this was something that sprang full-blown, spontaneously from that Council of War that they held in the, I guess it was the Douglas House on the night of January 2nd. And I think, which was the brigade brigade headquarters for, or I should say the headquarters for Brigade Commander General Arthur Sinclair. And he, as I recall, claimed credit for making the suggestion. But there's circumstantial evidence, which I cite in the book, that, and I know Larry agrees with me on this, that this was a well-conceived plan that Washington had all along. Now, I do recall reading that, when his troops recrossed the river, it was the fourth time in December they did this, from Pennsylvania back to New Jersey, and then, lined up along the southern edge of the creek, that which was the southern boundary line of Trenton, that he wasn't sure that they were going to stay there very long. And he, I guess his orders that he gave out suggested that the men should be prepared to move at a moment's notice. But then he had scouts out, of course, and they were monitoring what was going on in Princeton. And so he learned that, there was a large enemy force gathering there. And obviously, they were intending to take action against him. And so I think a couple of things that had probably entered into his thinking here. One is that, as he had written previously, his troops typically fought better when they were in a position in a defensive mode. And so rather than going out and meeting this larger, better trained, better equipped, better disciplined enemy force in open field battle, he would be better off fighting a defensive battle and occupying this, what he thought was a pretty strong defensive position, which is, it's, as I've alluded to, in some ways it was, because it was on high ground looking down on a creek that had steep sides. And aside from this narrow stone bridge in Trenton, not a lot of places where the enemy could cross easily. But I think that based on various things where he sent out scouts prior to that, the map that he had, the so-called spy map, I don't know if you're all familiar with that our friend Mr. Cadwallader, again, drew, another thing he did, based on the intel he received from an unidentified young man who was in Princeton, and described, the way the British defenses were aligned there. And so Cadwallader draws this crude map for Washington and accompanies that with an explanation, and which points out that Princeton could be approached from the southeast because the British, for whatever reason, presumably because they didn't expect any enemy movement from that direction, any enemy advance from that direction, had left undefended, that southeast quadrant of Princeton. And that's precisely what Washington's army did. Now, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but in various accounts, it's written that Washington and Greene and Knox, during the delaying action that Hand's men were fighting, when they were their last holdout, if you will, before they retreated into Trenton at Stockton Hollow, that Washington and Greene and Knox rode out there, and Washington basically told them to hold out as long as they could without risking their cannon, but to try to, in any event, to try to keep the enemy at bay until it got dark, which Hand's men largely succeeded in doing, because by the time the enemy advance guard gets in the Trenton, it's after 4, and the sun would set at 4:46 that day. So it was January 2nd after all. So that, to me, if that's true, and he's telling Hand, hold them at bay until it's dark, well, that would mean obviously, it's going to be too dark to fight. European armies normally didn't fight at night in those days. Of course, they normally didn't fight during the winter either. Now, I don't know if Washington knew this, but I guess it would be logical to assume, and in fact, I think this was the case, that Cornwallis was not about to fight a major battle on ground with which he was unfamiliar at night. But to me, that suggestion that, that Washington wanted to keep the British and Hessians from getting to Trenton until after it became dark suggested that he wanted to do something after it became dark. And I think because, if you line up all these various pieces of circumstantial evidence, it suggests to me that that was what he had in mind. I mean, Princeton was going to be a way station. That wasn't the ultimate objective. We know because of what he wrote to, if nothing else, what he wrote to John Hancock on January 5th, that New Brunswick, or Brunswick, as it was known, was his ultimate objective, because that was the main British supply depot in New Jersey. And supposedly, I don't know if it was still there at the time and may have been moved, but supposedly the British had a 70,000 pounds in sterling hard currency at that supply depot. At least that's what Washington thought. And he really coveted that. So that was his ultimate objective. And after the Princeton battle, he had to be talked out of that by Knox and Greene and whomever at an impromptu council of war on horseback, when they told him basically, your army's exhausted. These men are literally falling asleep on the ground, some of them anyway. You can't go up to Brunswick. If you do, you'll be caught from behind by Cornwallis, which I think would have happened. So he let discretion be the better part of valor, and then went up to Morristown instead. And I think it's a good thing for him and his army that he did. I think this was at least one instance in the war where things more or less worked out for Washington's plan. I mean, you can quibble about particulars. His battle plan when they got to Princeton was arguably too complex for such inexperienced troops as he had to be able to successfully pull off. Sort of a preview of what happened at Germantown almost a year later. But overall, if you look at what happened with the campaign, the events of January 2nd and 3rd, things went, generally speaking, according to plan for Washington, I think.
Okay. Excellent explanation. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry to be so long-winded.
No,
cool.
Appreciate all the knowledge. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's called Detailed.
It's all in the book.
Yeah, excellent.
I just ordered it.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, we are a little past the hour already. So, David, I really want to thank you. Your book, Winning the 10 Crucial Days, is available wherever fine books are sold, as they say. I will put a link up in the show notes. Anybody wants to go get it, but I'm sure you can just find that on Amazon yourself if you can't wait.
I will say, can I put in a put in a plug for a historic site? Of course, you can order it on Amazon, or, as Mike said, wherever fine books are sold, or not so fine books. If you want to buy a signed copy of the book and support a hallowed historic site, all the books that are in the gift shop at Washington Crossing Historic Park are signed by me. That is all my books, not all the books, and including this one. They do have an online, if you go on their, the website, Washington Crossing Historic Park website, there is an online gift shop where they sell some of the items in the gift shop electronically, including this particular book. But when you go on there, it'll give you the number of books that they have in stock, allegedly, and that's not at all accurate. So I think it's just they're trying to limit the number you can buy online. But you can, if you want to buy a book there and support, the park, you can do it that way. Or alternatively, you could just call up the main number, the visitor center, which is 215-493-4076, I believe. And just tell them, you want to order the book, Winning the 10 Crucial Days, and they'll ship it out to you. So just a suggestion.
Okay, lots of good options. All right, well,
Hey.
Thanks everyone for joining us this week. We've got another great one coming up in September. For those of you who, I used to post our roundtables on American Revolution Roundtable of South Jersey, ARRTOSJ.org. That site is dead now. I do have a list of past and upcoming roundtable episodes on amrevrt.org, which is the American Revolution Roundtable general website. If you go in there and look under virtual roundtables, you can see all the upcoming events for the rest of the year. And I'll post those links as well in the show notes. But yeah, thanks again, David, for this has been a wonderful presentation. We appreciate your time and expertise. And yeah, everybody should definitely check out his book and several of his other books I've really enjoyed too. So, don't just stop at this one.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to everybody.
Thanks,
All
Mike.
right. Bye-bye, all.
Take care.
Adios.
Thanks again for joining our discussion with author David Price, author of the book Winning the 10 Crucial Days. I've included links to the book on the blog episode for this podcast. If you'd like to join us live on Zoom for future discussions, please be sure to join my mailing list and receive advance notice, or sign up as a member on Patreon. Even if you join on Patreon at the free level, you will receive notices of upcoming live events. I've included links for both my mailing list and Patreon on the blog article for this episode. You can view the blog at blog.amrevpodcast.com. Again, thanks for joining us. I hope that you will join us again soon for another American Revolution podcast.